Hello, my name is Mike Connolly. I'm from Munjoy Hill in Portland and a retired history professor from St. Joseph's College. And today I'm representing the Maine Irish Heritage Center, and we're doing an interview for the collection of Francis and John Ford, which is located at the center. And our guest this afternoon is former city councilor, former mayor, and might I say a jack of all trades, Jack Dawson. And we're very happy to have him here with us today. Thank you for being here, Jack.
Pleasure.
We're going to be speaking a little bit about John Ford. And if we could just start with you mentioning, how did you first become interested in John Ford, or even how did you first become aware of John Ford?
I was brought up in a family that admired John Ford a great deal. My aunt Bessie was a classmate of his at Portland High, and my Uncle Phil was probably one of his best friends in Portland growing up. And so I heard a lot about John Ford, and Uncle Phil sometimes would say, John Ford's going to be in town. And at that point, I did not know who John Ford was other than seeing his name on the credits of a film. And it was only gradually that I began to hear things about John, that he was an outstanding football player. I think my Aunt Bessie in a diary mentions him and the success of his team. And then one night I was at a meeting of football people, and Howie Vandersea, who was the president of the chapter, and mentioned to me at the end of the meeting, did you know that John Ford was born in Portland? And I said, oh, I'm well aware of that. I know quite a bit about John Ford. And at that point I realized that Howie was a great film fan and admired the Ford films and its background so much. And the very next day, I had a call from Linda Nolane, who introduced herself as a friend of John Ford, and that she was appalled. She was calling me because I was mayor at the time. That's how she happened to contact me. And said that she had visited Portland and was appalled that there was nothing in the city that commemorated John Ford's birthplace, and asked if she donated a bust of John Ford, would I find a prominent place to place it. The bust turned out to be her idea. A bust was a full-size statue. And so when she came, we toured the city a bit and went to Portland High School, and right then convinced the people of Portland High School to rename the auditorium the John Ford Auditorium, and needed to inject a little history into the Portland High administration. But they were all for that. And then we visited the city manager's office and told Mrs. Lane that we needed some surety before we embarked on anything like this. And so she wrote us a check for $20,000 right there on the spot. And in the process, interrupted to talk with the president at Harvard because she was due there that evening to dedicate a chair. And so I began to realize that she was for real. And then before she left, we visited the art museum, and which she fell in love with as a nice spot for the statue. And so we proceeded in that direction to make arrangements to have the statue in front of the museum. It was a nice location, as we know, up in Congress Square, and the statue would be placed facing the State Theater, where John Ford had premiered one of his films. And shortly thereafter, we had a call from the curator of the museum, who informed me that the trustees had decided that a statue of John Ford was not appropriate. And he gave me 3 reasons. One was that John Ford's father owned a pub. He actually owned 3 of them in the Gorham's Corner area.
There's 3 reasons right there.
There we go. And the second was that he was not physically born in Portland. His family was living in Cape Elizabeth at the time, and therefore it would be a false claim. And the third one was the most striking, that he was not an artist. He was a filmmaker. And it would be inappropriate to put a statue of a filmmaker in front of the art museum. And I said, well, film is the 20th century vehicle of art, in our estimation. And I was on a limb because I didn't know much about either one of what I was talking about. But I did say, I do know this, that is our sidewalk, meaning the city, and we'll put on there what we think is appropriate. And he said, well, we didn't realize that. And I said, well, you have to realize that because this is serious business, and Mrs. Lane is very serious, and she's investing a lot of money in this, all for the city of Portland. And so we have to represent her wishes to that extent. And but I said, we have other venues in mind as well, and we'll look around. So actually what we were thinking of was the spot where John Ford's father had a couple of pubs. And that was Gorham's Corner. And as we all know now, we eventually decided on that spot. We redesigned the square there and pretty much made it the western boundary of the Old Port, which had become the city's heart and soul of attraction to tourists and natives alike. So that's how that part all came about. And then Linda Nolane visited several times after that. We went to the Modern Art Foundry in New York and met with the artists and decided what the right shape and motif of the statue would be. We didn't stop there. She asked me they wanted to include in the statue, which we did, some detritus from Monument Valley, where he made his Western films. So we talked with the Navajo people, whose reservation is part of Monument Valley, and they would not allow any of that detritus to be shipped just willy-nilly. It was a sacred land. And they said you would have to negotiate with the chief directly for that. So I told Linda about that glitz, and she said, well, I want you to go out there and meet with the chief, and because we want some of that sacred land as part of the statue. Linda Nolane was one who did not stop at just suggestions that something might not work. She has a whole history of putting her foot down and getting what she wanted. And so I went to Monument Valley, and I met with Chief Begay and others. And while I was there for 2 or 3 days, walking through the Monument Valley and chatting with people, some who remembered John Ford. One woman who worked in the museum there said there was a picture of one of the Navajo riding bareback. She said, that's my father. I said, oh, is he still living? She said, yes. And I said, well, how old would he be? And she said, well, we're not quite sure, but he's well over 100. And I said, is there any way I could meet him? She said, yes, I'll take you out. So that evening we drove out to his little hogan that he lived in, way out in the desert. And what was striking about that, they say the stars at night are big and bright, and it was an incredible scenario. But we met him, and his name was Billy Yellow. He was a medicine man by trade or by profession, whatever. He spoke no English, so she had to interpret. And I said to him, I was just so taken by the whole thing that I, again, went on a little bit of a limb and invited him to come to Portland for the ceremony at Linda's expense, of course. And he said, if you pay my way, I'll come. I said, then we'll do it. And As it turned out, Billy Yellow came to Portland for the ceremony. While he was here, he wanted to perform some rites, which included going out to the seashore and taking some water to bring back to mix with the waters of his native land. And they explained to me that's a custom, that if he'd gone to the Pacific, which he had at another time, and done the same thing also to the Gulf, and I think to the Great Lakes. And so it was important for him to bring those waters together. So that was my introduction to Billy Yellow and what followed from there.
I understand that he did a ceremony near the City Hall.
He did. And when we had the event at City Hall the evening before the unveiling, he performed these, we'll call them religious rites, that were very important to him and to the chief, who also came, and some of the family. He was a very happy man to do this. And he appeared in many of the John Ford films riding bareback, and taught bareback riding to many of the actors that were in the films. The visit that he made to Portland was historic. Linda wanted to invite everybody we could find who had either appeared in a John Ford film or was well acquainted with him. So we did that. I had conversations with Shirley Temple, Richard Widmark, James Arness. Some said they could come and some couldn't. John Ford's grandson came, son came.
Both Kevin Sturr and I got to know Dan pretty well.
Oh, you did?
He's always been very friendly toward us, and he sold a place out on the island.
Oh,
and
I didn't know that.
Moved back to California, but is a great character. If you remember, Jack, approximately how much time passed between your first meeting or telephone call with Lyndon O'Lane and the actual unveiling of the statue?
I was mayor in 1995-96, and the unveiling, I believe, was 98.
Yes.
So it was a very busy 2 years.
Wow.
Traveling to Monument Valley, traveling to New York, traveling to London, to tag all these bases that she felt were important in this enterprise.
Now, did she, in addition to funding the statue, did she fund any of the other activities connected with the festivities?
She did. We had a nice reception at the Victorian Mansion, and that was very appealing to her because at the head of the staircase in the museum is a window, a big stained glass window that they call the Louisiana window. Oh. And it was very much like the one that she had designed for Westminster Abbey. The window has the pelican, I believe, is the state bird of Louisiana. And that window depicts smaller pelicans. I don't know if they're called ducklings or what they're called, but each one represents one of the states of the Louisiana Purchase. And she presented me with a marble clock, a clock embedded in marble that has the names of all the states of the Louisiana Purchase as a gift. And she one day said to me, she knew I was running a sports camp in the summertime, and she said, can anybody go to the sports camp? And I said, well, it's somewhat expensive, but it's just like a regular summer camp thing. She said, how much is the tuition? And I told her, and she said, I would like to fund 20 young people of your choosing who couldn't afford otherwise to attend the camp. And she said, how much would that be? And she took it out in cash. 20 times whatever the tuition was. I can't even recall at the time, but thousands, and she just rolled it right out.
Jack, who in addition to her, would have been responsible for inviting the guests, especially the speakers, at the unveiling?
Okay, well, we had the Secretary of the Navy, we had Congressman Tom Allen, and I had to make those contacts, but on her behalf, she depended on me to do that, to do that directly. However, she had many friends in Louisiana especially who were very well connected. And when I would run into a roadblock, I would just call one of those people and they would intercede and open the door, and we had that. And that was true with the Hollywood people, the Hollywood hoi polloi of acting and so forth. And so I was able to find ways to make contact with them. Jack Lemmon was another. We just had nice, Richard Widmark, I think I mentioned. We had nice conversations. They just loved John Ford. Bessie Palmer was the name I remember.
I was interested in the visit of Sheila de Valera, the granddaughter of Eamon de Valera, former president of Ireland.
Yes.
And do you remember who made the contact there?
I did, but I went through those channels, just as I did with Maureen O'Hara, who was one of his favorite and most popular film legend.
Yes.
But Maureen was back in Ireland at the time, and I talked with her, and she had other commitments, but she said, there really should be nothing should stand in the way of me being at a John Ford commemoration, but I've made these commitments, and unless we can change the date and so forth. And of course, Linda was not one to be told to change the date. And Linda didn't like surprises. She would say to me, I don't want any surprises. And there were some things we did have to do an end run around what she wanted to do, and only for the sake of what she said was to be a great credit to the city of Portland. And we had to represent the city's interests in a lot of the things that we did. I
just wanted to tie together one strand. The report is that her initial contact with Ford was through filming something down in Louisiana, and her father at the time, I believe, was the governor of Louisiana. So the Fords stayed in the home, and she became familiar with them?
I think that's the way it went. Huey Long was the governor and left office, and her dad, well, I think it was lieutenant governor, so he became governor by virtue of that switch.
I see.
Brought John Ford to Louisiana to film, I think it was the horse soldiers.
Yes.
And they all became very friendly. And as a virtue, I think Linda was like 16 years old at the time, 18. But they invited her then to come and visit with them in California, and she not only visited, but she stayed a stretch, and that's how she, being the person she was, just became part of the whole scenario.
I wanted to go back to what you said earlier about the design of the statue. Now, George Kelly was the sculptor. How much influence did Linda Lane have, or how much, if any, influence did you have, or what were the influences that went into the actual design of the statue?
Linda had engaged George Kelly and Bob Spring. Bob Spring was the owner of the Modern Art Foundry, on other statues that she had made for a garden that is dedicated to her parents, as I understand it. So she was familiar with them, and they with her, so that when we started to talk about the statue, I met with Bob Spring a couple of times, and then later George Kelly, about the geography of the square in Gorham's Corner, and what would be suitable direction for him to be facing. And they wanted to have him with a pipe.
Yes.
And I said, that worries me, that tourists coming by or people roaming through the old port, kids, whatever. So they decided they would elevate it and have him up where it would be very difficult for someone to climb up without falling down. And that's where the detritus and the rocks and so forth from Monument Valley came into play, they would make that as part of the base in such a way that it would be difficult for anybody to climb up there and vandalize it. And it has stayed.
It has indeed. And the 6 blocks of granite around the outside, is it true that Howie did the inscriptions or wrote the inscriptions for
Howie
those?
did that, yes. We put Howie to work right away on those because I was amazed at how well versed Howie was on John Ford films and filmmaking in general. And he was a football coach at Bowdoin College, but he was very much involved with the culture of filmmaking. And when he found that John Ford was a Maine native, he was all the more. And when he found out that John Ford was a football player of great renown, that rang a bell with Howie too. There was a kinship there. So it was really an amazing coming together of different people with different varied interests, all focused on this one thing. Let's
speak a little bit more about the person himself, John Ford. In your opinion, what was the influence of growing up on Munjoy Hill being what it was at the time, on John Ford's outlook on life?
Well, Munjoy Hill, as I understand, and stretching out into the West End, Munjoy Hill being the East End, and the West End where St. Dominic's Church is, and now the Irish Heritage Center, is where John Ford worshipped as a young boy, was an altar boy there. But Munjoy Hill was a city unto itself. It was a melting pot of the very first order of Irish, French, Jewish, Greek, Polish,
Italian, African American.
Oh yes, and most of the Polish were more on the West End, but the Italian families and the Irish families were more on the hill, and has that whole late 18th century, early 20th century enclave of that melting pot has always been ripe for authors, artists, and it's really a microcosm of the whole story of immigration to America, the way the Irish had to find jobs, the kind of jobs they found, including working longshore, has been well documented and is still part of our heritage today. The working waterfront is a marvel.
Absolutely. It's been reported that he was an average student, but not a great student, but that John Ford was heavily influenced by some of his teachers. And the ones in the books, the biographies about Ford that are mentioned, it's interesting. One of them, Lucien Libby, he named a ship after in one of his films. The other two that he mentions, Murata Adams and William B. Jack, both had schools in Portland named after them.
That's true.
So these people were very influential on the young John Ford.
That's true. And I think John Ford was an appealing youngster to those people because he stood tall. He wasn't tall, but he stood tall, and he was very well liked by his classmates. Like I said, my aunt Bessie knew him and would speak of him. He was kind of like a teenage idol, maybe. And of course, his brother had become an actor, kind of on the sly, till his mother found out, and so forth. And but I think John was kind of a mischief maker as well. The way they talked about him. My Uncle Phil would say, who visited with John a lot out west, would say, "Oh boy, it's typical John Ford this, or typical John Ford that," and I gathered that that Phil and his two brothers and John Ford were quite a group.
Maybe the city of Portland might have been too small to contain such a personality.
Well, it appears that way. It's interesting how, when I think back to the conversations that we had with the museum people, and the renown that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow has, not just in Portland, but everywhere. And the beautiful statue we have of Longfellow. In fact, when I was mayor, this has got nothing to do with anything, but I have to say this, that we looked very seriously into turning the Longfellow statue to face Deering Oaks, because Longfellow speaks of Deering Oaks in his poetry. And it would seem a much more, although looking down Congress Street and at his old home, maybe that was the reason. It is where it is. But John Ford, with his filmmaking, which I maintained from the beginning as an art form, and Longfellow's poetry, these two men, how they branched out from the city, from almost the same neighborhood.
That's right.
And created such a wonderful legacy of art and connected it with their hometown.
Absolutely.
But like you suggested, it wasn't big enough for their enterprise. John Ford, growing up in Gorham's Corner with immigrants, goes out to Hollywood and finds that the Western saga is the best way of portraying American history. And the Navajo people who worked with him praised him highly for all he did for them and how much respect he had for the Native Americans. He employed them. He poured a lot of money into developing their schools and other interests that he had with them. And Longfellow's poetry that is just overflowing with patriotism and love of America. His Ship of State, his Paul Revere poems, his all of it, so much in concert with what John Ford was doing. And how do we know anything about John Ford's interest in Longfellow? Obviously, he was an attentive student, even though he may have not attained high grades, but he certainly made an impact in many ways, even as a youngster.
Now, all these years later, Jack, what are some of your favorite John Ford films, and why do you like them?
I think my favorite, the one that mesmerizes me, is Stagecoach, for a lot of reasons. One is the story itself, the bringing together into that little tiny vehicle of people from so far different backgrounds. That, but the filming of Stagecoach at full speed, the horsemanship, the danger that those actors were challenging underneath the horses going at full clip, and for him to have the courage to picture that and then bring it to reality is one of the things. Howie Vandersea is a great student of filmmaking, and he often referred to in our conversations about how John Ford framed things. Like Howie's favorite film, I think, is The Searchers. And when John Ford put his films together, he often had things in a frame. And you could see, according to Howie, how he's pointed this out to me, you can go from film to film and see almost an identical setting for some of his things, the doorways and things like that. And so, yeah, I would say Stagecoach is probably my favorite. I love the historical learning we gain from Grapes of Wrath. And I loved Mr. Roberts. That was one of my favorite films of all time when I first saw it. And I mentioned that to Jack Lemmon when I talked with him. I said, that must have been quite a thing with James Cagney and you trying to make that work. And he said, Ford made it work. He said, Cagney was no nonsense. And he said, I was an entertainer and a clown. And he said he just had all of us doing what we did best.
Yeah.
But he made us do what we did best.
Speaking of a supreme compliment, it was reported that John Steinbeck, when he finally saw the movie version of Grapes of Wrath, that he said that certain scenes of there were even more powerful than he had written.
Really?
In the story itself.
Well, they
That's quite a compliment.
Yes, yes.
Well, just to try to wrap this up, Jack, first of all, thank you for your time today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
What does it make you feel like now that I think John Ford has been fully appreciated by the people of Portland? The statue is there, it's well loved, and now the Maine Irish Heritage Center is doing what it can to try to acknowledge both Francis and John Ford. What does that make you feel like as somebody who was so instrumental in getting this started?
Well, I was more lucky than instrumental, Michael. It's one of those things that you pick up the phone and something happens, and you wonder how it happened. How did this come across my desk?
In terms of getting that statue where it is today, we're thankful for that.
Well, we are.
And again, Jack, I want to say again, thank you for your time today. And this will be, I'm sure, available on Portland Media Center and also the archives of the Maine Irish Heritage Center. And for all the things you've done in the past and the present regarding John Ford, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for including me. I'm really grateful for that.
All the best, Jack.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.